ልጅነት ዘመኔ እንዴት ነበር የሚለው እንግዲህ ከአንደኛ እስከ 8ኛ ክፍል የተማርኩት ያደግኩትም አድዋ ከተማ ነው። ይህን ያህል የተለየ አስተዳደግ አልነበረኝም። ልክ እንደማንኛውም የአካባቢው መንደር ልጅ በመንደር እየተጫወትኩ በመልሰ ሳባ ትምህርት ቤት ተማርኩ። ከዛ በኋላ ከ9ኛ እስከ 12ኛ ክፍል የተማርኩት እዚሁ አዲስ አበባ ነው። እዚሁ በነበረው ሃይ ስኩል ነው የተማርኩት። እዚህም ላይ ይህን ያህል የተለየ ነገር አልነበረም። አዳሪ ትምህርት ቤት ነው። በአዳሪ ትምህርት ቤት ነው የተሰጠንን ትምህርት እየተከታተልን ነበር። ከዛ ወደ ዩኒቨርሲቲ ገባ። ዩኒቨርሲቲም ያኔ እንግዲህ ወደ 60ዎቹ አጋማሽ አካባቢ የፖለቲካ እንቅስቃሴ በአዲስ አበባ ዩኒቨርሲቲ ጠንከር ያለበት ሁኔታ ነበር እና እንደሌላው ተማሪ ሁሉ በነበረው የፖለቲካ እንቅስቃሴ ተሳታፊ ነበር። የምኞት ወንድሜ ነበረው ይሄን ሆናለሁ ብዬ ማሰብ በጀመርኩበት ወቅት በጊዜ ሐኪም ሆናለሁ የሚል ሀሳብ ነበረኝ። አዲስ አበባ ዩኒቨርሲቲ በነበርኩበት ወቅት በሕክምና ፋክልቲ ገብቼ ለመማር ነበር የጀመርኩት። ኋላ ላይ ሌላ አቅጣጫ ተከተልኩ። ወደ ትግሉ ከሄድኩ በኋላ በዛው ቀረ ማለት ነው።
አያይ 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 ስጋኻ ጽበው ኢሌን አኻይ ጽበው ኢሌን ነገሮች ይፈታሉ፣ አዲስ ስርዓት ይቋቋማል የሚል ተስፋ ነበረው። ያ ሳይሆን ቀረ። ደርግ ስልጣን ያዘ መስከረም 2 ላይ። መስከረም 2 ላይ ደርግ ስልጣን ሲይዝ ብዙ ተማሪ ተስፋ ወደ መቁረጥ ገባ። ይሄ ነገር በተማሪ ንቅናቄ የሚፈታ ነገር አይደለም። ባለጠመንጃዎች ናቸው አሁን መሳሪያ ይዘው ስልጣኑን ከህዝብ የነጠቁት። እነዚህ ሰዎች በመሳሪያ ካልሆነ በስተቀር በሌላ መንገድ ማስወገድ አይቻልም ወደሚል ድምዳሜ መድረስ ጀመረ። ወደዚህ ድምዳሜ የደረሱ ሰዎች መሰባሰብ ሲጀምሩ እኔም ተቀላቀልኩ እና 67 አጋማሽ ላይ የትጥቅ ትግል ትግራይ ላይ ሲጀመር የትጥቅ ትግል ከጀመሩት ሰዎች ጋር ተቀላቀልኩ። አይ በልምሳይ ያው ትግራይ ዘዓዲ ያው በልምሳይ ያው
የትግል ህይወቴ ምን ይመስል ነበር የሚለው የትግል ህይወቴ ከሌላው ታጋይ ብዙ የተለየ ነገር አልነበረም። መጀመሪያ እንደሌላው ታጋይ ሁሉ ተራ ታጋይ ሆኜ ተመለመልኩ። በጋዜጠኝነት፣ በጸሐፊነት ሙያ፣ በአስተዳዳሪነት ስራ በሂደት የተለያዩ ኃላፊነት ስራዎች እየተሰጡ መጨረሻ ላይ ወደ ጦርነቱ ማብቂያ አካባቢ ወደ 81 አካባቢ የድርጅቱ ሊቀመንበር እስከመሆን ደረስኩ ማለት ነው። ከተራ ታጋይነት ጀምሮ በተለያዩ ደረጃዎች ድርጅቱን አገልግያለሁ። ጽበው ኢሌን አኻይ ጽበው ኢሌን አኻይ ጽበው ኢሌን አኻይ ጽበው ኢሌን አኻይ
Now, Meles Zenawi was the former guerrilla fighter who became Prime Minister of Ethiopia. He was one of the leaders of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which led the fight against Ethiopia's military regime in the 1970s and 80s. Mr. Meles became president of a transitional government in 1991, and then, from 1995 until his death, held the job of Prime Minister. Under his leadership, the country saw a big fall in infant mortality, a rise in access to education, and economic growth of up to 9% a year in the 21st century. But his authoritarian approach gained him many critics. Sebastian Bayin is a great-grandson of Haile Selassie and a leading figure in the British Ethiopian community. He met Meles Zenawi on a number of occasions.
The first time was when we were in exile. We were both young, angry people. He was traveling. I was continuing my studies while he had cut short his young life. So that was the first impression, but like any other refugee from that terrible period Ethiopia had between 74 and 91.
What sort of a life would he have led when he was involved in the guerrilla war?
It would have been very difficult. So you cannot imagine. His problems were more physical and upfront, while our problems were more mental anguish because of being in exile.
Our hope was to build a nation on a new basis, one of unity based on diversity and embracing and accommodating diversity. Democratic dispensation, faster economic growth, more equitable development, building the institutions of governance anew.
Meles Zenawi himself. Well, Elizabeth Blunt is a former BBC correspondent in Addis Ababa. She says Mr. Meles' background as a guerrilla leader had a significant impact on his style as Prime Minister.
They were a tremendously disciplined movement, very austere, and rigid discipline within the movement. They didn't tolerate dissent. Once everyone had agreed something, everyone had to follow that. And splits and arguments were put down quite ruthlessly. If you've been in a situation where sloppiness gets people killed, I think the result was he came out of it not very tolerant and wanting to make sure everything was done right and if necessary do it himself.
በተለያዩ ስራዎች ተመድቤ ልምድ አግኝቻለሁ። ከዛም በኋላ በሰላማዊ ጊዜ በተለያዩ ስራዎች አብዛኛው በጠቅላይ ሚኒስትርነት እና በሽግግር መንግስት ፕሬዝዳንትነት እዛም ላይ ቢሆን ተወሰነ ልምድ አግኝቻለሁ። ድርጅቱ እና ህዝቡ ይሄን ስራ መስራት ትችላለህ ብሎ ካመነብኝና ከመደበኝ
frankly, a control freak. He wasn't an evil man, but he was a very, very controlling leader.
But what was the condition of Ethiopia when he took power?
Ethiopia is a desperately poor country. It's had recurrent famines. It had been devastated by the civil war and by the brutality of the military government. His movement and its sort of sister movement from further north, from a province called Eritrea, had won the war together, but Eritrea wanted its independence from Ethiopia and so broke away.
Yes, I was there during the referendum of Eritrea. That militarily, I don't think Ethiopia could have done anything about it. It was a fait accompli. You know, we like it or not, they had to find their own way. They had struggled for a long time.
It seemed like a velvet divorce at the time, but afterwards they fell out and they fought an extremely bloody border war. Thousands of people were killed, and his own movement blamed him for letting Eritrea go and for not pushing right the way to victory at the end of the war.
There was a time when he was a bit of a darling of the West, wasn't there, when people like President Clinton and Prime Minister Tony Blair were really speaking very highly of him?
Yes, in the period running up to 2005, I think they only saw his good qualities, and those were very real good qualities. He was devoted to improving Ethiopia, to ending poverty. He was clever, he was articulate, he was not corrupt. But they didn't really see the consequences of his authoritarian side.
An African leader handpicked by Tony Blair to work on the Commission for Africa, the Ethiopian Prime Minister, Meles Zenawi, has insisted he is committed to democracy. Mr. Zenawi has been criticised for using excessive force against his opponents. More than 100 people have been charged.
In 2005, there was an election at which the opposition did far, far better than anyone expected. Basically, I think it was a protest vote, but the opposition did extremely well. They thought they'd done even better than the results that were declared. And there was a big row. People refused to take their seats in Parliament. People came out onto the streets. There were demonstrations. It turned into riots. And that was put down very, very harshly. Probably something like 200 people were shot dead in the process, and a lot more than that arrested. That really was such a stain on his government's record that aid donors, Britain continued giving aid, but they didn't give money to the central government after that. They channeled it to projects in the regions.
The situation had gotten out of hand very quickly. I am not happy that there were so many days. Nobody can be happy about that. 1 day is one too many. But at that time we had to restore law and order.
So basically he consolidated power as a traditional Ethiopian does from centuries. By tradition we are not Democrats. Matthew, you know how long it took to build democracy in
እርሱ በሙስና ውስጥ ቢዘፈቁ ማን ይቆጣጠሩታል የተባለው የመጀመሪያው ነገር ተስፋ አደርጋለሁ እንደማልዘፈቅ ነው። ነገር ግን በግለሰብ ብቻ መተማመን ትክክለኛ ነው ያላምንም። ቀደም ሲል እንደጠቀስኩት የኢትዮጵያ መንግስት የምናቋቁመውና የምናስፋፋው ስርዓት በግለሰቦች ላይ ተንጠለጠለ ሳይሆን በህጎች እና በተቋሞች ላይ የተመሰረተ መሆን አለበት የሚል ነው ያለን።
this country. And so really, in terms of 20 years, in perspective, the scaffoldings of democracy have been built. I don't think we can reverse that, but it's only still a very, very delicate scaffolding.
We need more in the sense of institutionalizing democracy more firmly. We need more in terms of making democracy relevant not only to the capital city but also to the villages of this country where 85% of the population live.
You may actually find yourself in a situation one of these days where the people say, we don't want you. Would you accept that?
Absolutely. That would be the pinnacle of my life's achievement.
To be voted out of office democratically?
In a proper democratic process. That would, to me, signify that this democracy has matured.
He didn't seem to enjoy himself much. He worked all the time. We're told he played a bit of tennis, but that's about his only known recreation.
And he never smiled.
We didn't see him smile very much. There was one night I was working in Addis Ababa at the time of the Ethiopian millennium, when it was the year 2000 by their calendar. Big event. Foreign guests, dignitaries, everybody. But that wasn't what people were talking about the next day. The next morning, everybody was talking about the fact that he'd been seen smiling and dancing. He was dancing with his wife, and he was wearing nice, relaxed Ethiopian national dress. And it was really the only time people had seen him that relaxed, and everyone talked about it.
So how would you evaluate his time in office?
I think he held Ethiopia together after the fall of the military dictatorship. He steered it towards a much more prosperous future, perhaps. But he hasn't been able to relax, and he hasn't been able to break the long Ethiopian tradition of secrecy and silence and conformity and keeping people in line. That was true under the emperor, it was true under the military government, and it's been no less true under the government led by Mr. Meles.
Elizabeth Blunt on Meles Zenawi, who's died aged...
ይበልጥ ታዋቂ ለመሆን ምን ማድረግ ያስባሉ? ይበልጥ ታዋቂ ለመሆን አላማ አይደለም። ስለዚህ በዚህ ዙሪያ ማድረግ እንቅስቃሴ የለኝም። መረር ያለ ጥያቄ ላይ ሲጠየቁ ለምን ይቆጣል የተባለው እንግዲህ ታዛቢው ነው የሚገባው እንጂ እኔ እንደምቆጣ አይገባኝም ነበር ማለት ነው። ግን ሳስበው አሁን ከእድሜ ጋር በተያያዘ እየተሻሻልኩ መጣሁ እንጂ መጀመሪያ ላይ ትንሽ ቆጣ ማለት ባህል የነበረኝ ይመስለኛል ከበፊትም ጀምሮ ያሻሻልኩ ይመስለኛል። ግን እንግዲህ ከታዛቢዎች አመለካከት እንደሚታየው መሻሻሉ ተሟላ እንዳልሆነ ነው የሚያመለክተው። አግብቷል የተባለው አሁን አግብቻለሁ፣ ስንት ልጆች አሉት የተባለው 3 ልጆች አሉ።
نعغاي كتبوي إلي نعغاي كتبوي إلي نعغاي كتبوي علي نعغاي هيا برهان هيا زجيب التسمع هيا زنو هيا زريتو حلفا هيا بكا هيا بكا إذا أقرزي أس عريفا إذا أقرزي أس عريفا عدي يا عوي بالمساي يا عو إثيوبيا عدي يا عوي بالمساي يا عو تقراي عدي يا عوي بالمساي يا عو يا وان خدي قربت شاقري يا وان خدي قربت شاقري اي 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 سقاغي اي 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 سقاغي سبوي إلينا اغاي سبوي إلينا اغاي سبوي إلينا اغاي سبوي علينا اغاي